The holding cell was cold and sterile. Kethral hung there like a broken thing, her once brilliant white scales now dull and gray from weeks of confinement. Her body was twisted in a way that no living creature should ever have to twist. The restraints that held her cut deep into her flesh, and her spine curved upward in an unnatural hump that made it painful just to look at her. Every time she tried to straighten, metal dug deeper. Every time she moved, fresh pain shot through her body. The Velthari researchers worked around her like she wasn't even alive. They moved through the observation deck with their instruments and tablets, taking notes, making measurements, discussing her condition in cold, technical language. Jake Peterson, who worked as the lead scientist on the project, stood closest to the glass barrier. He was a tall man with tired eyes, the kind of person who had spent so long looking at data that he'd forgotten how to see actual living things. He held his tablet up, recording images of Kethral's deformed spine, nodding to himself as if he was looking at numbers in a spreadsheet instead of an animal suffering in front of him. Kethral tried to breathe. Each breath was a struggle. The infection spreading through her body made everything harder. Her lungs felt thick and heavy. When she exhaled, a small cloud of mist formed on the inside of the crystalline wall. Around the places where the restraints bit into her skin, dark patches had started to form. The infection wasn't just local anymore. It was spreading like frost creeping across a winter window, branching out in thin lines of inflammation and decay. Her body was fighting back, but it was losing. One of the younger researchers, a woman named Lisa, pointed at the infection marks on Kethral's shoulders. "That's getting worse," she said quietly. "We should treat it before it becomes systemic." Jake turned away from his tablet and looked at her. The expression on his face wasn't cruel exactly, but it was empty of anything that looked like concern. "If we treat her now, we compromise the research," he said flatly. "This is clean data. We need to see how her biology responds to the infection without intervention. Once we start treating her, we won't know what part of the recovery is natural biology and what part is the treatment. The whole study becomes contaminated." Lisa started to say something else, but she stopped. She'd been working there long enough to know that there was no point arguing. The director had already made his position clear. Kethral was a research variable, not a patient. She was an object to be studied, observed, and measured. Her suffering wasn't a medical crisis, it was data. Kethral's pink eyes moved slowly across the observation deck. Her eyes were one of the few parts of her that still seemed alive, still seemed to contain something like consciousness and awareness. When she looked at Jake, there was something in those eyes that went beyond animal instinct. There was intelligence there. There was understanding. She knew exactly what was happening to her, and she knew that the people in white coats had decided her life wasn't worth saving. Jake made more notes. He recorded her breathing patterns, the color changes in her scales, the way her body trembled from fever and pain. All of this would go into the report. All of this would be analyzed and discussed in conference rooms by people who had never seen her, never heard her breathing, never watched her eyes follow them as they moved through the observation deck. When Jake finally turned to leave, Kethral watched him go. She didn't cry out. She didn't beg. She just watched him walk away with her pink eyes, and then she looked back down at her twisted body, at the restraints cutting into her skin, at the dark patches of infection spreading across her scales like a creeping shadow. In the corner of the cell there was a water container, but it was too far for her to reach given how she was suspended. There was no medical attention, no painkillers, no comfort of any kind. There was only the cold light from above and the hum of the machinery that kept the cell sealed and monitored. Hours passed. The infection continued to spread. Kethral's breathing became shallower, more labored. Nobody came to check on her. Nobody called for a doctor. The research was continuing exactly as planned. The data was being collected. The variable was deteriorating on schedule. And somewhere in the observation deck, in the darkness beyond the glass, the researchers took their notes and waited to see what would happen next. The medical board meeting took place in a room that smelled like stale coffee and recycled air. Around the long table sat representatives from every major institution on the station. There was Dr. Kevin Matthews from the Coalition Medical Authority, a man who had built his entire career on not making waves. Next to him sat Patricia Chin, who handled insurance claims and spent her days calculating risk versus profit. From the planetary government there was Richard Hayes, a bureaucrat who had learned a long time ago that the safest answer was always no. And then there was Dr. Robert Green from the Interspecies Ethics Committee, an older man who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else but here. Someone had called the meeting because Kethral was dying, and the question on the table was simple. Whose responsibility was it to treat her? Kevin Matthews opened the discussion. He was a practical man, not unkind, just tired. Let's look at the facts, he said, sliding a document across the table. We're talking about a non-standard patient. She's not human. She's not even from any of the species we have medical protocols for. The treatment options are limited, the risks are high, and frankly, the success rate is unclear. He leaned back in his chair. My recommendation is to decline active intervention. The liability exposure is too significant. If we attempt treatment and something goes wrong, who are we liable to? She's a research subject, not a citizen. There's no legal framework here. Patricia Chin nodded along. She'd already done the math. The cost would be substantial, she added, pulling up numbers on her screen. Specialized antibiotics for her physiology, equipment we'd have to calibrate specifically for her biology, surgical intervention for the spinal damage. We're looking at somewhere between 50 and 100,000 credits minimum. And that's if everything goes smoothly. If complications arise, that number doubles or triples. Our budget doesn't accommodate that kind of unusual expenditure, especially for a creature that isn't part of our standard patient population. Richard Hayes from the planetary government adjusted his glasses. He had perfected the art of sounding reasonable while refusing to take action. Additionally, we need to clarify jurisdiction here. The research vessel isn't technically within our planetary boundaries. It's in the neutral zone of the outer docking sector. That means the Research Facilities Administration bears primary responsibility for the health and safety of all creatures within their facility. We can't just assume responsibility for something that falls outside our jurisdictional authority. It would set a dangerous precedent. Dr. Robert Green listened to all of this without saying much. When he finally spoke, his voice was weary. The Ethics Committee has been reviewing the case, he said slowly. And while we have concerns about the treatment protocols being used on the subject, we're still in the documentation phase. These things take time. There are forms to fill out, reviews to conduct, approval processes that need to be followed. We can't rush into decisions without proper procedures. Kevin leaned forward. So what you're saying is that none of us can help her because it's not technically our responsibility? That's exactly what I'm saying, Richard confirmed without a hint of irony. This needs to be escalated through the proper channels. The research facilities director should be petitioning the Coalition Medical Authority, not the other way around. We're here to respond to requests, not to initiate interventions. Patricia added one more thing. And frankly, if the research facility hasn't requested our assistance, maybe that tells us something about their priorities. They seem satisfied with their current protocols. We shouldn't presume to override their decisions. Back in the medical cell, Kethral's fever was climbing higher. Her body was burning from the inside, struggling against an infection that no one was going to treat. Her breathing had become shallow and irregular. Each breath fogged the crystalline walls of her cell, and then the fog would fade as her exhausted lungs pushed out air. In the med bay that served the station, there were nurses on duty. Good people, trained professionals who had dedicated their lives to healing. But when they wheeled equipment past Kethral's cell, they didn't stop. They had been told that she wasn't their patient. She wasn't in their system. There were no orders for her care, no medical charts, no treatment plans. So they walked past, and some of them looked away because it was easier than looking at a living creature suffering without being able to do anything about it. One nurse, a woman named Dorothy, actually stopped and looked at Kethral through the observation window. She could see the fever in the way the dragon's scales had lost their luster. She could hear the struggling breath. She knew what an untreated infection looked like, and she knew what would happen if no one intervened. She wanted to say something, to push for action, but she also had a job to keep and bills to pay. So she stood there for 30 seconds, made eye contact with Kethral's pink eyes, and then she walked away too. The protocol was simple. If it wasn't officially a case, you didn't treat it. If it wasn't in the system, it didn't exist. Responsibility became a game of hot potato, passed from one institution to another until everyone could say with complete honesty that it wasn't their fault, it wasn't their jurisdiction, and it wasn't their problem. Kethral lay in her cell and died a little bit more with every hour that passed. The transport docked at 0600 hours, and nobody on the station was expecting what was about to walk through that airlock. Dr. Robert Mitchell had a file that preceded him. He was the kind of inspector that institutions dreaded getting notice about. In his 15 years as an independent medical auditor, he'd shut down facilities, exposed cover-ups, and made powerful people very uncomfortable by simply refusing to look away from problems. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't someone who cared about budgets or liability or jurisdictional boundaries. He cared about one thing: whether sick people were being treated. His first morning on the station, Robert was supposed to meet with the research facility director and begin his standard inspection routine. It was supposed to be 3 weeks of paperwork review and compliance checking. Nothing dramatic. Nothing personal. Just another job. He never made it to that meeting. As Robert walked through the main observation corridor on his way to the director's office, he passed the medical wing. The crystalline holding cell caught his eye because it was unusual. Most research facilities kept their subjects in sealed containers, but this one was transparent, visible to everyone walking by. Robert stopped walking. He stood there in the hallway and he looked. What he saw made him go still. Kethrel hung in the cell like a broken sculpture. Her white scales, which must have been beautiful once, were now dull and discolored. Her body was emaciated, skin pulling tight against bone. The spine that curved upward in that horrible unnatural hump was the thing that grabbed Robert's attention first, but it was everything else that told him the real story. The restraints had worn through scales in places, leaving raw patches of exposed tissue. Around those wounds, he could see the dark signs of infection creeping like a living thing across her body. Her breathing was labored and shallow. Even from outside the cell, Robert could see her ribs moving with effort. He stood there for probably 30 seconds just looking. A young technician walked past him and didn't even glance at the cell. To these people, this was normal. This was just part of the work environment. Robert felt something cold settle in his chest. He turned and walked straight to the director's office. He didn't make an appointment. He didn't follow protocol. He walked past the assistant's desk and knocked on the director's door. Victor Hammond looked up from his work, annoyed. He was a thin man with graying hair and the kind of expression that suggested he'd spent a long time explaining himself to people and had stopped feeling bad about it. "Dr. Mitchell, I wasn't expecting you until—" "There's a dragon dying in a cell in your medical wing," Robert said without preamble. He didn't sit down. He didn't introduce himself properly. He just stated the fact like someone reporting a fire. "That dragon is infected. She has fever. She has a spinal injury that's been untreated. She's malnourished. And from what I can see, nobody's done anything to help her." Victor set his pen down carefully. "That's research subject number 7. She's part of an ongoing study on cross-species infection response. The data we're collecting is quite valuable." "I don't care about your data," Robert interrupted. "I care about the fact that you're allowing a sentient creature to suffer in a cage while you take notes. That's not research. That's torture with a clipboard." Victor's face hardened. "You need to understand the parameters here, Dr. Mitchell. That creature is not a patient. She's a research variable. We have strict protocols." "Your protocols are letting her die," Robert said flatly. "And that's not acceptable. Not on my watch. Not on any watch that anyone with a conscience is running." "You're here as an inspector, not as a treating physician," Victor said, his voice taking on that careful, controlled tone of someone explaining rules to someone he found difficult. "Your job is to review our protocols and file a report. It is not your job to interfere with ongoing research." Robert looked at him for a long moment. He thought about the 15 years he'd spent fighting against this exact kind of thinking. He thought about all the institutions he'd had to push before anything changed. He thought about the people he'd been told he couldn't help because of some regulation or protocol or bureaucratic boundary. "That dragon is dying," Robert said quietly. "Not in a week. Not in a month. In the next few days, probably. Her fever is high enough to cause organ failure. That infection is systemic. She's running out of time." He stepped closer to Victor's desk. "I'm going to treat her. You can file a complaint. You can request my suspension. You can do all the bureaucratic things you need to do to protect yourself. But that creature is not dying on my watch because you decided research was more important than her life. If you treat her without authorization, you'll be violating direct orders from this facility's administration," Victor said. "Good," Robert replied. "Then we're clear on where we stand." He turned and walked out of the office before Victor could respond. He had a medical emergency to address, and for once he wasn't going to let regulations get in the way of actually helping someone. Robert moved fast. He went straight to the medical supply room and started gathering what he needed. Antibiotics that might work for dragon physiology. Sterile dressings. Surgical tools. Pain medication. The staff that saw him didn't try to stop him at first. They thought he was authorized. It wasn't until he was already heading to Kethral's cell that someone realized what was happening and ran to alert the director. By then, Robert was already unlocking the cell. The door hissed open and the air inside was thick and hot. Robert could smell the infection immediately. It was a smell he knew well from his years in medicine. The smell of a body fighting something it was losing against. Kethral lifted her head slightly when the door opened. Her pink eyes fixed on Robert, and there was fear there, but something else too. A kind of desperate hope, as if she'd been waiting for someone to come and somehow she knew this was different. Robert moved slowly and deliberately. He didn't rush. He didn't make sudden movements. He approached Kethral like he was approaching a frightened animal, which technically he was, but also like he was approaching a person who needed his help. Because that's what she was. "Hey," he said softly. "My name is Robert. I'm a doctor. I know you're hurting. I know your body is fighting an infection that you shouldn't have to fight alone. I'm going to help you. I need you to trust me, okay? I'm not going to hurt you more than you're already hurting." Kethral made a sound, something between a hiss and a low rumble. It wasn't aggressive. It was almost like she was trying to speak back, to communicate in her own way. Robert started with the fever. He had ice packs designed for large creatures. He placed them carefully against Kethral's sides, avoiding the infected areas. He spoke to her the whole time, explaining what he was doing in a calm, steady voice. She seemed to understand. Or maybe she just understood the tone. Either way, she stayed calm. She didn't thrash or try to hurt him. It was like she'd been waiting for someone to treat her with gentleness, and now that it was finally happening, she wasn't going to fight it. Next came the infections. Robert cleaned every wound carefully. He used solutions that would disinfect without burning. He worked methodically, talking her through each step. "This is going to feel cold," he'd say before applying something. "This might sting a little bit, but it's going to help," he'd explain as he worked. And each time, Kethral would tense slightly but accept it. She was cooperating with her own healing. The antibiotics were the tricky part. Robert had to calculate the dosage based on Kethral's weight and physiology. Too much and he could harm her. Too little and the infection would continue spreading. He'd studied cross-species medicine for years and he'd never treated a dragon before, but the principles were the same. Watch for reactions. Start conservative. Adjust as needed. He administered the first dose slowly, watching for any signs of allergic reaction. Her breathing stayed steady. Her eyes remained clear. Then came the spine. This was where Robert had to be most careful. The deformity had developed over weeks of being held in the wrong position. Her vertebrae had shifted. Muscle and ligament had adapted to the twisted position. Straightening it would hurt, but not straightening it would eventually paralyze her. Robert placed his hands on her spine. He could feel the twisted bone beneath the scales. He worked slowly, using techniques he'd learned from studying alien anatomy. He applied pressure gradually, coaxing the spine back toward alignment. Kethral made sounds, low groans and rumbles, but she didn't try to stop him. It was like she understood that the pain he was causing now was medicine, not cruelty. By the end of the first day, Kethral looked different. Not better yet, but like someone who was actually receiving care. Robert set up a comfortable resting position for her, removed the restraints. Victor Hammond could fire him for that if he wanted to, and made sure she had water within easy reach. Jake Peterson, the original researcher, watched from the observation window. He'd come to see what was happening and he'd stayed to watch the whole process. His face showed shock. Not the kind of shock that came from anger or outrage, but the kind that came from watching something you thought was impossible actually happen. Over the next 5 days, Robert came back every single day. He administered antibiotics. He changed dressings. He checked her fever. He spoke to her like she was a person because she was. By day 3, the dark patches of infection started to fade. By day 4, Kethral's breathing became deeper, easier. By day 5, when Robert checked her temperature, the fever had broken completely. Kethral's pink eyes were bright again. Her scales were starting to show hints of their natural white color returning. When Robert entered the cell, she lifted her head and made that same rumbling sound, but this time it didn't sound like pain. It sounded like recognition. Like gratitude. Robert stood there and felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like a doctor again. Not just someone following protocols or protecting institutions, but someone who had actually saved a life. And it had cost him everything. The news didn't come from official channels. It came from the way Kethral moved through the station, healthy and awake. It came from the conversations people had when they thought nobody was listening. It came from whispers that turned into statements that turned into recorded testimonies that spread across every communication network in the sector. By the end of the first week, everyone knew what had happened. A human doctor had treated an alien creature without permission. He'd violated protocols. He'd overstepped his authority. And he'd saved a life that everyone else had decided wasn't worth saving. Victor Hammond received the first official notice 3 days after Kethral's fever broke. It was a suspension of his research license, pending investigation. The Dominion Research Authority wanted answers about his treatment protocols, his handling of the subject, and his refusal to authorize emergency medical intervention. What had been a clean research project suddenly looked like potential animal cruelty, and the paperwork that had seemed so reasonable a week ago now looked like evidence of negligence. But that was just the beginning. The Velthari government issued a statement expressing concern about the research practices being conducted in their sector. The merchant coalition that had approved the original research quietly distanced itself from the project. News outlets started picking up the story, and it spread in ways that no one could control. Human doctor defies authority to save alien life. Medical ethics crisis at research station. Dominion under fire for neglecting patient care. Other species started paying attention. The Coalition of Independent Worlds, which included representatives from over 40 different alien civilizations, opened an inquiry. They wanted to know how many other research subjects had been denied treatment. How many other creatures were suffering in cells while bureaucrats debated liability? What other facilities might be operating under the same kind of protocols? Within 2 weeks, inspection teams were being sent to 17 different research stations across the sector. Within a month, 3 facilities had been shut down. Within 3 months, new interspecies medical ethics standards were being drafted. And through it all, Robert waited to hear what would happen to him. The Dominion Research Authority formally charged him with violating direct orders from facility administration. They recommended suspension from his position as an independent medical auditor. They filed complaints with the Medical Licensing Board. His career, built over 15 years of fighting for patients, was being dismantled because he'd refused to let someone die. He knew it was coming. He'd known it the moment he walked into Kethral's cell. But knowing it and living through it were two different things. What he didn't expect was what happened next. Kethral asked to give a statement. Not through an interpreter. Not through some official channel. She asked to testify directly to the Coalition Investigation Committee about what Robert had done for her and what everyone else had failed to do. On a video feed that was recorded and shared across the sector, Kethral spoke. Her voice was deep and resonant, the sound of something ancient and powerful. She talked about the pain. About the fever. About lying in that cell and watching people walk past without helping. She talked about what it felt like to have everyone decide that your life didn't matter enough to fight for. And then she talked about Robert. This human came, she said, and her pink eyes looked directly at the camera. He did not ask what regulations prevented him from helping. He did not calculate what it would cost him. He looked at suffering and he refused to accept it. He treated me like I was worth saving. Like my life mattered. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was stronger. Your rules and protocols made your own people refuse to help me. Only a human, an outsider, had the courage to break your rules and do what was right. If you want to understand what is wrong with your systems, you need to ask yourself why it took someone defying your authority to do the merciful thing. The statement was downloaded 40 million times in the first week. It was translated into 93 different languages. It was shown in schools and medical institutions across the galaxy. It became the centerpiece of the ethics investigation. Robert lost his position. The Medical Licensing Board revoked his certification, though not because they thought he'd done anything wrong. They revoked it because the Dominion Authority demanded it, and politics mattered more than principle at that level. His career was effectively ended. But something else happened too. He started receiving messages. Other doctors. Other medical professionals. People who'd also felt trapped by systems that didn't make sense, by protocols that harmed people, by bureaucracy that prioritized regulations over lives. They started finding him. They started offering him work. Independent facilities. Human research centers. Places that valued what he'd done instead of punishing it. And beyond that there was something larger. The galaxy had watched a human doctor choose compassion over career. They'd watched him refuse to hide behind regulations or pretend that someone else's suffering wasn't his responsibility. Humans had never been known for being particularly strong or particularly fast or particularly advanced compared to older species. But they were known now for something else. For an absolute, stubborn refusal to abandon someone in need, no matter what the cost. Other species started changing their protocols. Not because they were forced to, but because they'd seen what humanity looked like when it stopped pretending that rules mattered more than people. They started asking themselves hard questions about their own ethical standards. Kethral recovered completely. She became an advocate herself, speaking about medical ethics and the importance of treating all sentient beings with dignity, regardless of their species or status. Robert built a new career helping facilities improve their treatment protocols. He trained other doctors in cross-species medicine. He became something bigger than an auditor. He became proof. Proof that one person willing to break the rules for the right reasons could change everything. Proof that humanity's real strength wasn't in what they could do to others, but in what they were willing to sacrifice for someone they didn't even know. The galaxy was watching. And it was learning.